Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. And they entered in, and found not the body of the Lord Jesus. And it came to pass, as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. And as they were afraid, and bowed their faces down to the earth, they said unto them, Why seek ye the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words, and returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things unto the 11, and to all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not, which is the first 11 verses of Luke chapter 24. It was Sunday morning, the 9th of August, 2020. And Joyce had died the Thursday night before. COVID-19 was still raging. The Bible study group had started meeting again in person around May of that year, but on Sunday mornings we were still at home, watching recorded videos of the messages. We wouldn't start meeting again in person for another 2 months. I was the speaker that week, but I hadn't yet recorded the message. As an aside, when Joyce's mother died at the start of June 1992, Kernersville Little Theater was in the middle of the rehearsal period for their first production of South Pacific. If I remember correctly, they've produced it again since then. Joyce was supervising the makeup, but her mother had gone into the hospital for what turned out to be the last time. So Joyce had set up contingency plans in case her mother died during the rehearsal period, which is what ended up happening, or during the actual run of the show. I was the assistant stage manager on that production, and it was a good thing that Joyce had shared her plans with me, because the next time I went to rehearsal, Doug Weeks, who was either the producer for that particular show or the KLT vice president in charge of production that year, or maybe both, as well as being a cast member, called me over to one side. He'd just gotten the word about Joyce's mother, and he wanted to know what, if anything, I knew about the makeup situation. Fortunately, I was able to reassure him about the whole thing, particularly that Joyce was one of those people who need to keep busy immediately after a death and let their grief out a little at a time in manageable bits. And apparently I'm one of those people too. Anyway, it was a few minutes after 8 o'clock on that Sunday morning in 2020. I was still in bed, drifting half in and half out of sleep, the way many of us did back in those days when we didn't have anywhere to go because of the pandemic. When all of a sudden, Joyce was there, shaking my bed to wake me up. This was unusual because Joyce didn't do that sort of thing. It was even more unusual because, if you remember, she'd been dead for about 2.5 days at that point, since about 10:30 on Thursday night. I figured out later that day what had happened. There was an earthquake here in North Carolina, up near the town of Sparta in Allegheny County. It measured 5.1 on the Richter scale, the strongest earthquake in the state for over 100 years, and the second strongest earthquake in the entire recorded history of North Carolina. And it hit at 8:07 in the morning, just as I lay dozing in my bed. That's why the bed shook. As for Joyce being there, shaking the bed to wake me up, that's pretty obvious too. I had just suffered a great trauma, and I was moving out of the initial shock into the phase that I later described to somebody who had just lost his wife as the time when I felt like curling up into the fetal position and howling like a wounded animal. The death, especially the sudden or unexpected death of someone to whom you were really close, can hit you particularly hard. And a number of us in this room know that. It isn't at all uncommon for people to report that they continue to feel the presence of the newly departed for a time. In fact, some of you may well have experienced something of the sort yourselves. You're used to having the other person around, so you catch yourself turning to share a laugh with them, or to ask for their opinion about something. You really can't help yourself. You've just gotten into that habit, and now you have to learn a new habit. YouTuber Dan McClellan, who holds advanced degrees in religion from the universities of Oxford and Exeter in England, points out that experiences like this happen all the time. So the mere fact that shortly after Jesus' death, claims began to spread among his followers that various of them had experienced the presence of the risen Jesus can't really be cited as proof of the resurrection. As McClellan points out, these people had just gone through extreme trauma and were primed to interpret their experiences in the light of their growing conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead. I have to agree with McClellan on this one, but I'd also like to call your attention to passages like Luke 24:10-11, which I just read, which states, "It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and other women that were with them, which told these things unto the apostles. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not." In other words, the early church preserved a memory of a time when there was at least some initial resistance among their number to accepting the idea of Jesus' resurrection. What's more, this memory is preserved in all 4 New Testament Gospels. In Matthew 28:16-17, for instance, we read, "Then the 11 disciples went away into Galilee, into a mountain where Jesus had appointed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." The original text of Mark, the earliest of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, apparently ended with the women leaving the empty tomb and saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Mark 16:8. But in the so-called longer ending of Mark, which probably dates to the early 2nd century, which is about 30 to 50 years later, and which now appears as Mark 16:9-20, Mary Magdalene brings the disciples word of Jesus' resurrection. According to Mark 16:11, however, they don't believe her. And later, when Jesus himself appears to the disciples while they're having a meal, he chides them for their unbelief. And of course, most, if not all of us, are probably familiar with the story of the so-called Doubting Thomas in John. Paradoxically, the memory of a time when not everybody in the Jesus movement believed in his resurrection might actually be one of the strongest arguments in its favor as a historical event. Instead of the set of encounters with the risen Jesus as reported by the earliest Christians and recorded in the pages of the New Testament. In fact, I would actually be more skeptical if the resurrection accounts agreed perfectly in every detail, because I would suspect that those accounts were some sort of literary construct. What we have instead is a collection of people's experiences of the risen Christ, handed down by word of mouth for several decades before being written down. And we all know that people's perceptions of the same events usually differ from each other, and sometimes markedly so. I remember an experience from the summer of 1993 when Joyce, Kim Williams, and I were all cast in the production of an original script called Just Desserts at Adam's All-Night Diner at the Stained Glass Playhouse. The setup of the play is that God and the devil agree to hold peace talks at the Greasy Spoon, where Joyce happens to be working as the waitress. Kim, who at the time was the pastor of the church where the playhouse is located, played, wait for it, the devil. Well, that's all right. When they did it again, guess who played the devil that time?
You.
Somehow that seemed to tickle Alvin Tyndall's sense of humor. Anyway. Kim was clad all in white from his head to his feet, and Joyce said he looked like a cross between a good humor man, the ice cream salesman, because of his costume, and a live Cupid doll because of his stage makeup. The entire cast had been having trouble learning the script. And it was now the Wednesday night before we opened on Friday. So this is 2 nights before opening night. And some people still wanted to be on book. The director had put his foot down and instructed the stage manager not to feed us lines. So if we got in trouble, we'd have to figure our own way out of it. It would certainly be fair to call what happened that night a wild rehearsal. At one point, we jumped from Act 1 to a similarly written passage in the last act, but fortunately I was able to pull us back on track that time. I can't say just how much of the script we ended up leaving out in that particular rehearsal, but I can say this. Whenever Joyce and I would talk about that rehearsal, starting that very night, after it was over with, if you were listening to us, you would be convinced that we were at 2 completely different rehearsals. Our perspectives and our recollections of the event differed that greatly. For Joyce, who essentially had a theater degree, the night was an unmitigated disaster. That unplanned jump from the first act to the last act and back again was a perfect illustration of what she meant. We were a very long way from giving a polished performance. I, on the other hand, saw that night then, and I still see it now, as a triumph. You see, I didn't fully believe that we could actually pull the whole thing off. And that rehearsal, as rough and awful as it was, proved to me that we could do it. It was one of the few times that the entire cast had been on stage at the same time the entire rehearsal period. So 6 weeks. I think something similar is going on with the resurrection accounts in the New Testament. The reason that the post-resurrection accounts are so very different from the sort of experience you have when you catch yourself feeling momentarily like your recently departed loved one is still there is that whatever happened on that morning so long ago was so strong and so convincing, so compelling even, that people were willing to die rather than to deny their experiences. Eventually, this was true even if their introduction to that experience was by hearing about someone else's experience first. Think of first-generation skeptics like Saul of Tarsus, whom we know better as the Apostle Paul, or like anybody who becomes a Christian nowadays. There are no eyewitnesses around now. The resurrection is a mystery, which I couldn't explain even if I wanted to. It's rather like what Sir Thomas Malory wrote near the end of Le Morte d'Arthur about the legend of King Arthur's disappearance and prophesied apocalyptic return. Yet some men say in many parts of England that King Arthur is not dead, but had by the will of our Lord Jesus into another place. And men say that he shall come again, and he shall win the Holy Cross. I will not say that it shall be so, but rather I will say, here in this world he changed his life. Here in this world he changed his life. Now, I'm certainly not equating the resurrection of Jesus Christ with the legend of King Arthur's return. But what I am doing is taking essentially the same stance as Malory. I can't explain the resurrection any more than Malory could explain the story that had come to him. So I'm not going to make any more of an attempt to explain than he did. If you want a lesson in apologetics or a reasoned defense of the historical veracity of the resurrection, go listen to somebody else's sermon. The way I see it, one of the things Easter is all about is the movement from grief into hope. Now, most of you this morning will perhaps think of me more readily in connection with Christmas than with Easter, and that's true enough in a sense, I suppose. After all, I have been responsible for putting together the annual Christmas candlelight service for how many years now? And it is certainly true that Christmas holds a special place in my heart as the time when I recharge my spiritual batteries for the entire year. Perhaps the things I love most about Christmas are being reminded to have hope, hearing again how ordinary people can become channels of divine grace, being reminded that God can enter the world in an entirely new way through something as simultaneously commonplace and miraculous as the birth of a child. And thinking how the Spirit of God is working to bring reconciliation to the whole of creation, not just to humans estranged from God and from each other. Christmas is a believer's holy day in a way that Easter isn't. Now, don't get me wrong, Easter does speak to faith and hope, like Christmas does, because, as I said, one of the things Easter is all about is the movement from grief into hope. But Easter is also tempered by the experience of how brutally we can deal with our spiritual opportunities, with each other, and with ourselves. Easter is the sadder but wiser holy day that manages to find the renewal of life springing into existence amidst the rubble we've managed to create. Nadia Bolz-Weber, an evangelical Lutheran pastor whose name some of you may remember from hearing Kim or Cheryl or me mention her, puts it this way in her book, Pastrix. The Christian faith, while wildly misrepresented in so much of American culture, is really about death and resurrection. It's about how God continues to reach into the graves we dig for ourselves and pull us out, giving us new life in ways both dramatic and small. I don't know how many of you will remember this, or even if any of you will remember it, but a friend of mine and I have a debate we revisit periodically. It's about Terry Gilliam, who is the only American member of the old Monty Python comedy troupe, and what his cinematic masterpiece as a movie director really is. My friend prefers Brazil, which is one of those dystopian visions of a world set in a future reality. My problem with Brazil is that the main character of the film basically just wallows in his situation and doesn't really do anything about it. My friend would say I'm not being fair about that, but I really don't care. I much prefer The Fisher King, which is a story about sin and redemption, told as a sort of modern-day quest for the Holy Grail. So I'm a sucker for a good redemption story. Many, perhaps most of us are. I believe in the resurrection. And because I believe, I can recognize the wisdom in these words from the late Jürgen Moltmann, a German theologian who wrote, "Believing in the resurrection does not just mean assenting to a dogma and noting a historical fact. It means participating in this creative act of God's. Resurrection is not a consoling opium, soothing us with the promise of a better world in the hereafter. It is the energy for a rebirth of this life. The hope doesn't point to another world. It is focused on the redemption of this one." The hope is focused on the redemption of this world. These acts of redemption can be as dramatic as the new birth of freedom that Abraham Lincoln spoke about at Gettysburg on that November day, or they can be much simpler and more everyday. Blogger Esther Joy Gates has put it this way: what if Jesus' life was less about appeasing a wrathful God and more about showing us what love looks like when it's embodied? When it feeds people, washes feet, weeps with the grieving, stands beside the outcast, speaks truth to power. What if the resurrection isn't a magic trick that proves divinity, but a whisper of hope that says, love doesn't die, not really? In the nearly 5 years since Joyce died, I've come to a growing appreciation of some words originally from William Penn's More Fruits of Solitude. J.K. Rowling quotes them along with a passage from Aeschylus at the start of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, her 7th and last novel in that series. Rowling has stated that she wrote her Harry Potter novels as a kind of Christian allegory, and that she drew her inspiration in part from C.S. Lewis and his Chronicles of Narnia. There's a line near the end of the Apostles' Creed, and yes, I'm fully aware that Quakers don't recite creeds, which enumerates the communion of saints as one of the beliefs to which you're giving assent. One of the things this means is that we have communions with the Christians of the past and those of the future through Jesus Christ. An even more basic meaning of the phrase is that we don't stop loving someone just because they died, nor do they stop loving us just because they died. We just can't interact or experience each other's presence the way we used to. That is what William Penn was talking about, and I quote, "Death is but crossing the world as friends do the seas. They live in one another still. For they must needs be present that love and live in that which is omnipresent. In this divine glass they see face to face, and their converse is free as well as pure. This is the comfort of friends, that though they may be said to die, yet their friendship and society are, in the best sense, ever present because immortal." In other words, our relationships are lived out in the presence of God. And because God is eternal and immortal, there's a sense in which our relationships are eternal and immortal as well, even in the face of death. So maybe, just maybe, There's a sense in which my momentary perception of Joyce shaking my bed to wake me up on that Sunday morning just after she died wasn't quite as far off base as it seemed at the time. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.